As carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS for short, moves from small pilots to major infrastructure projects, it remains one of the most discussed and often least understood technologies in our world's energy transition. At Shell, they've been working in CCS for well over a decade. From Quest, one of the world's first commercial-scale carbon capture projects, to new partnerships with Polaris and Northern Lights, they're building a global portfolio that captures CO2 from refineries, transports it by pipeline or ship, and stores it deep underground. In Alberta, Shell's Quest facility has safely sequestered more than 9 million tons of CO2 since 2015. It's a first-of-its-kind project that helped shape the regulations, policy frameworks, and public trust that other CCS projects now rely on. We wanted to learn more, so we sat down with Bernhard Koudelka, Shell's Vice President of Carbon Capture and Storage, to talk about the global state of CCS, what it takes to make these projects work, and why Alberta's geology, workforce, and regulatory leadership make it one of the best places in the world to scale this technology. Here on Carbon Copy. Welcome to the Carbon Copy podcast. If you can just start by introducing yourself, your role at Shell, and your journey in CCS.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and good morning to you. I'm really happy to be here, and this, as we said, is my first podcast. So my name is Bernhard Koudelka. I'm the Vice President for Carbon Capture and Storage at Shell, which means that I run our global business unit that looks after capturing CO2, transporting it, and ultimately sequestering it on the ground. We have quite a large project portfolio as well as an asset portfolio that I'm ultimately responsible for. I've been 25 years with Shell, largely in commercial roles in the traditional upstream and integrated gas businesses. And since a couple of years, I'm heading the CCS business unit.
And I think most of our listeners are quite familiar with Shell, but maybe for those that are less familiar, can you give us a quick overview of your company's involvement in carbon capture?
CCS is a very important lever for Shell. The reason why CCS is so important is probably for four main reasons. The first one is it is a technology that's there to help us to decarbonize our own assets, particularly our scope 1 and 2 emissions from our downstream business and our upstream business. It is a tool that we can offer to our customers to basically abate their emissions, number 2. Number 3 is that it, of course, enables other energy vectors. Think about biofuels, think about blue hydrogen, think about lower carbon intensity hydrocarbons, like, for example, abated LNG, that will help us to basically reduce the carbon intensity of our energy footprint. And the last reason is that CCS is a fundamental building block for carbon dioxide removals. So in the future, we believe that carbon dioxide removals will play an important part in a net zero energy system. And then the ability to safely store and sequester the CO2 will be a critical component of that. Of course, when you look at Shell, Shell has been a trailblazer in this industry. We have been active in CCS for many years, and we play along the full spectrum of that value chain. We're an emitter, of course, so we have our own scope 1 and 2 that we want to abate. We are a technology provider, so Shell has significant technology, both pre-combustion and post-combustion. So pre-combustion, we have a technology that's called ADI+. Post-combustion, we have a technology that is called CANSOLV. Both of these are world-leading technology services that we also license to third parties, by the way. And of course, we are a transport and storage provider. And in that, we have a significant portfolio of assets around the globe. Maybe just to quickly recap what assets we have. So we have 3 assets that are either in operations or close to starting up. That is Quest in Alberta, which has been running since 2015 and stored safely more than 9 million tons of CO2. There's a project in Australia called Gorgon. And there's a project in Norway, Northern Lights, which essentially was mechanically completed in 2024. Apart from those three, we also have two projects that are in execution. One again in Alberta, which is called Polaris Atlas, where we want to store another 650,000 tons of CO2 from the Scotford refinery. And the other one is Portus, a project in the Netherlands, where we want to take CO2 from the Pernis refinery in the Netherlands and store it offshore in the North Sea. Apart from the projects that we have in execution or up and running, we also have a significant portfolio of projects that we still want to mature to final investment decisions. We are in the short term primarily looking at US, Canada, and Europe, simply because those are the regions where we have the strongest policy support and a very clear regulatory framework when it comes to CCS. But beyond that, we're also looking at Asia and the Middle East because of the significant customer footprint we have in those regions. I believe that the first wave of projects will, of course, be, as we said, in the European-US cluster, but in the longer term, Asia-Pac and the Middle East will be very significant areas in the world for CCS.
So where did carbon capture start, and why are folks interested in this as one of the tools we can use to mitigate emissions?
Yeah, very good question. Carbon capture, of course, is not a single technology, Chris. It's a basket of technologies that has been developed over time. So if you look at the capture part, for example, which today largely relies on amine-based systems, where essentially you have amines that take impurities out of gas streams. That technology has been around since the 1930s, at which point it was used to basically clean up natural gas mostly, and ever refined for the last 80, 90 years. On the transport and storage side, we have done carbon transport or CO2 transport and CO2 storage since the 1970s, particularly for EOR purposes. So again, a technology that has been around for the best part of 50 years. All of these technologies, of course, largely also draw from the oil and gas industry. We're talking about building pipelines, drilling wells, dealing with subsurface uncertainty. All of that is adjacent to an industry that we are involved in and have been involved in for many years. So it is a basket of technology that is essentially de-risked. Now, there's always developments in around the technology, where we refine the applications and technology that's out there for the use of actually sequestering CO2. But overall, it is not a novel technology per se. We have multiple operations in the world. As we talked about, EOR has been around for more than 50 years. And in essence, we are storing about 50 million tons as an industry every year across the globe, which is a testament to the fact that the technology is working and essentially safe and de-risked. Now, when you talk about what's the role of CCS in the energy transition, when you read Exxon reports like from the International Panel of Climate Change or the International Energy Agency, they all agree that CCS plays a vital role in this, in order to achieve the Paris agreements and to tackle climate change. There's agreement that permanently sequestering and storing CO2 is a key enabler, because we will still rely on industries that either have residual carbon emissions or still require some form of molecular energy going into them. The last thing I would say, whilst there are 50 million tons of CCS in operations today, there are another 300 million tons of projects that have been announced. So there's quite a sense that this industry is on the verge of scaling significantly. And according to some reports, we expect that we'll be over a gigaton by 2030 as an industry.
Fantastic. And I think that's such an underappreciated point in these conversations, is the fact that, some of these technologies have been around for quite a long time. They've been substantially de-risked, but we also know, as a result, we know where they work and maybe where they're not as strong and where we're going to need some innovation to move them forward. So I think that's a really key point. Sometimes folks say, CCUS, it's new, it's exciting, it's simple. That's why we would like it as a solution. I say, well, it's maybe one of those things. It's maybe exciting, but it's certainly not new, and it's certainly not simple. I mean, it's no more simple than any other decarbonization technology. We know all these technologies take a lot of effort and a lot of really smart folks, such as yourself and your organization, behind them to make them happen. So that's a really, I guess, key point that I want to stress in the podcast. So thanks for bringing that up. You commented already on sort of the vital role of CCS as a solution for certain industries, and I really like the framing you had. You said, industries that are going to have, significant residual emissions, or those industries that are, by definition hard to abate or hard to electrify, where there's going to be some need for molecular energy and or some component of process emissions. So if you could just maybe unpack that a little bit and sort of the criteria for where you see CCS as a key element of net zero.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, CCS is not a panacea to the energy transition. The energy transition is a real societal challenge, and it requires a lot of levers to be pulled in order to get to a net zero energy system by 2050. And it will fundamentally change the way people live, the way people work, the way people move, the way people play. And CCS will be a tool in this, but so are many others. And if you look at this, I think in the first instance, society needs to become a lot more energy efficient. We need to try and electrify as much as we can. We need to do fuel switching. We need to look at, for example, advanced biofuels. I also think that hydrogen, nuclear energy, all will have a role to play in the energy transition, get us to net zero. Having said that, with all these measures, I still think there's a very fundamental role for CCS in all of this, because it will help to capture and store and sequester residual emissions from particular hard-to-abate industries. For example, when you look at certain industries that have CO2 emissions that don't stem from burning hydrocarbons, like cement, for example, CCS often is the only viable solution to reduce those CO2 emissions. Other industries like steel, petrochemicals, often really require direct heat for their processes. So electrification may not be the answer. And then post-combustion capture of CO2 with CCS seems to be one of the most competitive options to decarbonize this industry. And the last thing I would say, Chris, of course, is as the society, we have a lot of installed capital in the current energy system that we're using. To change it to something else will take a lot of time. And CCS is a solution that's here and now to help in that transition, to basically do post-combustion capture on the emissions that we currently have as we go through a transition, as we basically renew our industrial base, as we build stronger transmission grids, as we install new and more renewable generation. During that period of time, CCS can be a viable solution to basically tackle the emissions today and offer a solution in that transition phase.
Yeah, really well said in terms of CCS as that bridge technology that gets us through the transition on some of these, particularly challenging sectors. I think that's an excellent perspective. And yeah, if there's one theme from this podcast or from my career, it's that, there is no such thing as a silver bullet. So I really like that perspective. And we see all of these technologies, of which CCS is one, being complementary in some ways in terms of getting us to these ambitious targets. So let's maybe dig a little bit deeper into Shell's journey with CCS. And earlier you mentioned the Quest project, which, as we know, is one of the first commercial carbon capture projects globally, and was certainly a first in Canada and Alberta. We know that Shell had an integral role in that project, as did the government of Alberta in making that project happen. So can you maybe just take us through the story of Quest, where the project originated, how it progressed, the milestones it achieved, and the overall role that you see it playing in Shell's CCS strategy?
Yeah, so the Quest facility is, of course, a flagship project in the industry. And as you said, it was a project that was developed in close cooperation, particularly also with the Alberta government and the federal government in Canada. And I think that collaboration between public and private entities to drive a project forward was a real trailblazer for the industries, and I think still shows the way around how to best tackle the challenges of the energy transition and get these early projects off the ground. So Quest, as we just established, is a project in Alberta. It is a CCS facility that captures, transports, and stores CO2 that comes from the Scotford upgrader. So Scotford is a refinery near Edmonton, and an upgrader is essentially where you take bitumen and you upgrade it into synthetic crude that you then distill into traditional products. And from that upgrader, you take almost clean CO2 because it requires hydrogen. We take that CO2 and we then transport it in a short distance to an injection location where we essentially then inject that CO2 about 2 kilometers underground into a sandstone formation, which is called the basal Cambrian sands, where it then is stored permanently. The project has been up and running since 2015, and it stores roughly 1 million tons a year. So we have just achieved the milestone of storing more than 9 million tons, and we're looking forward to celebrating the 10th year anniversary. The one thing I would say about Quest, which is also really important, is that Quest, because it was done in collaboration with the Alberta government and with the federal government, plays also a big role not only in sequestering CO2 emissions, but also in educating the public and the industry around what it takes to do a CCS project. So we're publishing an annual report that really also describes what Quest is doing and the learnings and the experiences that we have in that project, Chris.
Fantastic. And I think that's one thing that we at ERA are particularly excited about, is this concept of what it takes to be first and what those first-of-kind projects can do to help educate others and help move the needle on some of these technologies. And so you do really need those first-of-kind projects to happen, to get the learnings, to get the results, and to ultimately understand how we can do these technologies better in the future. So really, really important to have projects like Quest. I'm just going to circle back on Quest, and you already talked about the fact that you're using this facility as an opportunity to educate governments, other industry players, and others on how CCS projects work and on the outcomes. Can you maybe just take us through some of those key lessons learned from the Quest project and what's really in the meat of those reports that you mentioned coming out every year?
Yeah. So Quest to date has basically exceeded all expectation, Chris. It has captured more CO2 than promised. It runs at a much higher reliability than we initially thought. And it was also constructed and runs at lower cost than we initially anticipated. So with all these successes and experience in project management, Quest has really truly contributed to the development of the industry, but also to help to decarbonize the industrial base in Alberta. And if I look back at what is key to success, is that partnership with the Alberta government in particular, but also with the federal government that had a lot of foresight in sort of the early 2010s or later 2000s to basically realize that CCS could be a vital tool to decarbonize the industrial base. And in that process, engaged in a bilateral conversation with the industry to say, okay, what does it take to get these projects up and running? And not only was it a conversation around what financial support does the industry need to get these early projects off the ground, but also what kind of regulations do we, for example, need before we can invest in CCS project as a private investor. And these conversations with the Alberta government have been really open and transparent, and a lot of developments have happened on the back of these conversations. If I now look at what regulations are there in Alberta around pore space tenure, about requirements for monitoring, about quantification protocol, around clarity on long-term liabilities, the province was one of the first ones to develop this, and I think it's largely down to the conversations and the constructive collaboration between the government and private industry. And I think that is such a fundamental key to the success of the Quest project. And I think that's a key learning that we're trying to replicate in other jurisdictions that also want to move into CCS and deploy CCS as a solution to their industrial base. Of course, The other support that we got is also on the financial side, which I think we need to recognize that at the time when Quest was conceived and ultimately take investment decision in 2011, carbon pricing was very low. So it required substantial support both from the provincial government as well as from the federal government. And about 60% of the projects ultimately were government funded, which was a key requirement at that point as well. The last thing I would say is, on the back end of Quest, you now see the province of Alberta sort of moving into a much more free market approach to CCS with the recent tendering of CO2 licenses in the province, the establishment of a much clearer framework around storage and licensing agreements in the province, which I think all stems from the success that Quest is, which allowed regulations to basically develop, but also to gain confidence that in the technology, and that can be a real solution to the industrial base in Alberta and ultimately around the world.
Fabulous. And what a great perspective in terms of the progression. And like you say, when you do the first of kind project, there's, the need for real financial incentives to make these things go. But certainly as, even as ourselves here at ERA, but also more broadly speaking, the Alberta government, the federal government, we obviously don't want to be putting up first of kind level funding for every subsequent project. So there is a real value in those first projects of unlocking the understanding of what it takes from a regulatory perspective, from a policy perspective, to make these kind of industries and these kind of technologies self-sustaining in the future and help unlock, as you said, the sort of more free market investment into what's going to be ultimately a very large industrial scale rollout of technology. So I really like that perspective, and that's absolutely what we think of here at ERA when we invest in first of kind projects is when we invest in the first one, how is that going to unlock the second one, the third one, and ultimately the 10th, the 100th, and so on. But in your introduction, you had alluded to a couple of Shell's other exciting CCS projects. So two of the ones that our listeners may be familiar with and that I know you mentioned are Polaris and the Northern Lights project. So could you maybe just take us through a little bit of a background on what those two projects are all about and how they really build on the foundation of the earlier work that we've talked about so far?
Building on the Quest success, and maybe we'll start with the project in Alberta, which is Polaris Atlas. There's actually two projects. So Polaris is the project at the Scotford refinery, and Atlas is the transportation and the sequestration of the CO2. Polaris is a project that captures another 650,000 tons of CO2 per annum from the Scotford refinery. And then we'll take that CO2 and the Atlas transport and storage hub basically transports 22 kilometers to a storage location and then injects it again into the basal Cambrian sands 2 kilometers underground. Atlas Carbon Storage Hub is a joint venture between ourselves and ATCO Empower. And basically in the first phase, it will be solely used by the Scotford refinery for the 650,000 tons that I described. But then we have plans to expand that hub into a multi-user hub, taking emissions from other companies and potentially also from ATCO themselves. If you then look at the Northern Lights project, that is a very, very different archetype, Chris. So Northern Lights is the first cryogenic CO2 value chain in the world. Essentially, that means that emitters are far away from the storage location for CO2. So what is happening is that the emitter captured the CO2, they then purified, liquefied, it gets then put in a ship and then sailed to Norway to a storage location. In Norway, it gets then basically offloaded and sequestered as it is with Quest or with Polaris and Atlas deep underground. It is a project that is part of a larger government initiative in Norway. It's called the Longship Project, where the Norwegian government essentially financially supported both the emitters as well as the transport and storage provider to build this first cryogenic value chain. The project is now on the transport and storage side complete. And in its first phase, the project will store about 1.5 million tons of CO2 per annum. The idea is that project hopefully will get expanded soon. to about 5 million tons.
Wow, 5 million tons. Sorry, I was just letting that sink in. That's and I think that's so important, and it's really what we want to see when we're thinking about scaling an industry. Is we want to see, each project in some way being, maybe not every single one's going to be bigger, but a step forward in some way, whether it's scale, whether it's performance, whether it's the partners involved, like you said. And I think both of these two initiatives, and as you said, it's actually a couple of projects each, are so important in terms of representing that advancement. So can you maybe speak to the value of partnerships and collaborations on, this whole carbon capture and storage value chain, whether that's other industry partners, governments, and other stakeholders that you're going to need to work with on these sort of projects?
Partnerships are crucial in that space, Chris, because no single entity can build CCS value chains. We have to realize that CCS value chains require emitters, transport companies, perhaps shipping companies if it's a cryogenic value chain, storage providers, regulators as we just established, governments, but also financing institutions, NGOs, and the broader public to all come together to build these value chains. And it requires very close integration across these different players along a very long and complex value chain. And particularly when you look at the challenges that we have today. So today, as we established, we have about 50 million tons per year of CO2 injections. We want to scale this to, depending on which report you read, but anywhere between 3 to 7 gigatons by 2050. That requires a massive scale up and a significant degree of collaboration between the different entities that I just mentioned. And giving the lead time in the CCS projects, maybe just for the audience to give them a perspective of how long it actually takes to build a CCS project. So usually we talk about anywhere between 5 to 10 years from having the idea of a CCS project to getting it defined and built. We then operate projects anywhere between 20 to 30 years, and then you have a post-closure monitoring period for another 50 years. Giving that lead time, 2050 is not that far away and requires collaboration and alignment between all these players right now. So we set the foundations and the ecosystems for us to scale the industry effectively. At the moment, we need to recognize that there is a significant codependency with government, simply because these early projects, as we discussed earlier, rely significantly on government support. The moment we have the early projects off the ground, the moment we have significant infrastructure build out, I think the industry will be able to operate more freely amongst each other, and government support will become hopefully less relevant. But in these early phases, is absolutely crucial. And therefore, we need to have these engagements with the governments right now to basically build these proof points, these early projects, to be able to scale the infrastructure and then scale the industry on the back end of that. What we do as Shell, maybe just to answer that part of the question, is of course we are in multiple industry associations, coalitions, and multiple partnership. A lot of our CCS projects are done in partnership to drive advocacy, to drive the uptake of CCS in the industry, but also to get alignment on technical and policy issues. So, for example, when you look at the technical side, the requirement to basically standardize CO2 specifications, for example, or other standards on the technical side is so critical, because it helps for the system to be more interconnected, but also it avoids being disadvantaged if you're an early mover in that industry.
So obviously platforms like the GHGT conference and other international conferences focused on CCS are a great way to share out some of those lessons learned and some of those best practices that you've been talking about throughout our conversation today. Can you maybe just speak to your view on the way those sort of knowledge sharing opportunities are essential to help advance CCS?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Shell was pleased to be a platinum sponsor of the event, Chris. I think it was a great event. And generally, conferences like the one in Calgary are critical for a nascent industry like ours. It's a great platform to discuss residual technical challenges, to discuss innovations, as we talked about, to work with stakeholders and partners to align on common technical solutions, on common specifications, on common regulations to help set the groundwork to ultimately be able to scale the industry. And to give you an example, we talk a lot about the collaboration in the value chain. And one of the key collaboration, apart from relationships with the government, is the relationship between a transport and storage provider and the emitters. And often transport and storage provider are, of course, oil companies or energy companies who have been active in the field of oil and gas for many years. And customers come from very different industries. And these industries have traditionally not really worked together a lot. And therefore, building that understanding of what it takes to be an investor in the transport and storage side, and building an understanding of what it means to be an emitter in a emerging and new regulatory environment is absolutely critical for us to start working together effectively. And these projects are large capital investments. They take a lot of time. And in order for these early value chains to work, both sides, emitters and transport and storage provider, need to almost commit at the same time. And therefore, platforms and conferences like the GHT 17 are critical to foster the dialogue, to help to build a platform, to help to build common understanding, and to drive the industry forward. The other one, of course, is a conference like this also help to be very clear what it takes in terms of regulatory framework, in terms of governmental support that is needed to bring this industry forward and to align on common advocacy positions.
Yeah, wonderful. And I just think it's so important to see organizations coming together with that intention to share and to learn. As you said, these are very large capital investments, and if everybody has to learn from scratch how to do them, it's really hard to see the industry scaling. Whereas if each project, whether it's by the same company or by different companies, can build on that past expertise and build on those lessons learned, that's really where we're going to get the momentum that we need to see this forward. I also really like that you touched on the skill sets that are needed to build these kind of projects. And one reason that we in Alberta see CCS as a really exciting opportunity is that a lot of those skill sets are here. We have the oil and gas expertise. We have the ability to build these large projects, to build pipelines, to understand the subsurface, to understand the monitoring of a CO2 plume once it's injected. And that expertise doesn't actually exist everywhere. So I'm really happy you brought that up. That's something we're very keen on, and we actually see it as an opportunity for Alberta to lead the way and to bring the skill sets that the world needs to the table. On that note, we certainly like to see ourselves as a leader for CCS development, and I think, or I hope that Shell would agree, given your past and current projects in the space. So, what makes Alberta particularly well suited for projects like Quest and like Polaris?
As we discussed before, Chris, first of all, I think Alberta as a province and generally also the federal state, we're real trailblazers when it comes to the CCS industry. So a lot of foresight that has happened sort of 10, 15 years ago when Quest was first conceived. And since then, of course, the province and the federal government have put a lot of efforts into place to provide a really strong regulatory framework that is very supportive of the CCS industry. It provides clarity on what is required to build CCS projects. It provides clarity on, for example, long-term liabilities and monitoring requirements. So there's certainty of what it takes to be an investor in the industry, which makes the province really attractive. At the same time, of course, Alberta has a large emission space. There's a lot of heavy industry in Alberta. And that, coupled with the fact that the geology in Alberta is very good and very well appraised, so very well understood, makes it for a very good storage location. So when you look at the technical cost of carbon capture and storage, the transport and storage component of that carbon capture and storage value chain is very competitive in the province of Alberta, giving sort of the circumstances and the positive geology. Last thing, when we talk about Alberta, in particular is, as you said, there are a lot of adjacencies with existing industries. So we have, of course, supply chains that we can rely on. We have the skill sets, and it is a natural extension of a lot of the industrial activities in Canada. So for me, Western Canada and Alberta in particular are a real sweet spot when it comes to the CCS industry.
What do you see as the key challenges for our region to maintain and even advance as a leader in this area?
Yeah, so there's a few things that as an industry we still need to figure out. So one is if you have multiple hubs adjacent to each other, which now is currently the plan in Alberta, how will the different operations interact with each other? Particularly when it comes to pressure management in a subsurface, I think that's still something that we as an industry, together with the regulators, need to develop. Because that is sort of a novel scenario, and we have limited experiences generally, but also from a regulatory perspective. So I think that's one of the key challenges. The other one, Chris, is of course, ultimately, you will have different industries that still need to work with transport and storage hubs of CO2. And as I said earlier, the collaboration with different industries and the oil and gas industry is new. And we need to find effective business models to work together in the most efficient way. And we are having open and transparent discussions with a number of prospective customers. But as I said, it takes time for both sides to understand each other and understand what are the residual risks, how do we best mitigate them, and how do we build robust long-term relationships with entities that historically haven't done a lot of business together. So I think these are challenges. I think all of them can be overcome and there will be solutions to it. But these are the signs of a nascent industry.
I like that optimistic outlook. And if there's one thing we here at ERA are used to dealing with, it is those challenges, like you say, that come with any nascent industry, any nascent technology, and figuring out ways to collaborate to overcome them. So I think that's such an important mindset to have going into this, is that, we know there are problems and even there might be some unknown unknowns, but it's by working together and basically collaborating that we're going to overcome them. So thanks for that. What do you see as the biggest opportunities for CCS in the next decade, both for Shell and also just for the industry as a whole?
Yeah, so as we discussed earlier, I think once there's a critical mass of infrastructure in place, particular pipelines, terminals, ships, perhaps for cryogenic value chains, we believe there will be an additional degree of freedom for CCS providers as well as emitters to interact with each other. I think there will be more interaction between different storage hubs. There will be redundancy in the system, and it will more freedom in the commercial constructs that we have, because at the moment we largely have tramline solutions where emitters and transport and storage provider almost have a point-to-point solution. And I think that will change in the future. And that will also then hopefully allow regulators and governments to take a step back, because we will then have broader market-based structures to underpin the economics of CCS value chains. And that is, of course, driven by two factors in my mind, Chris. One is carbon pricing. We need to have stable and clear carbon pricing. And then as that develops, there will be more incentives to decarbonize industries. And the other one is, of course, if that carbon pricing ultimately translates into day-to-day products, where then users of CCS services can basically get the benefit of decarbonizing the industry through decarbonized products and the ability to sell decarbonized products into the market, I think we will create another incentive for this industry to scale. The other thing that I see as a real opportunity is that I think as a company, and giving the adjacencies that CCS has with the oil and gas industry, that as this industry scales, we'll be able to drive down costs. We will see scale benefits take hold and ultimately drive better returns in the industry, both for emitters as well as transport and storage providers. And I think that is also critical in order to scale the industry, because there is still, of course, residual risks in building CCS projects. And ultimately, you need to have an industry that's able to stand on its own two feet, that creates rewards that are commensurate with the risks that are being taken, because only then can you get financing institution coming to the plate. You have then ability to build stronger financial structures. And only then I think you're able to scale the industry from today's 50 million tons to, let's say, 5 gigatons by 2050. That's really where I see the opportunity space going forward.
That's such a great perspective. And I think it's really, really well aligned with how we at ERA see these challenges and opportunities. Ultimately, if you look at any of the climate or emissions reduction technologies that have been successful, and have scaled and reached that full commercialization, it's the ones for which there's a robust market and financing environment to support them. It's not ones that have needed ongoing government support. But all of these things, when we talk about market and financial viability, need ongoing policy support, even if it's not direct incentives. And so, broad-based policy incentives, like the ones we have in Alberta here with the tier system, and I think that's basically exactly what you've described as, that's really where technologies like CCS are going to be able to compete and be able to attract the right market supports, the right financing, in order to be able to be a sustainable industry in the long term. So I really appreciate that perspective.
Yeah, if I just make comment on this as well, Chris. So because you mentioned the tier pricing, and of course carbon pricing is critical, but if we talk about the environment in Alberta and Canada in general, there's a number of incentives that really support the industry, not only just tier pricing, right? So we have investment tax credits that were paramount for us actually to take our final investment decision. These are critical incentives and a critical enabler for early decarbonization value chains. And Alberta has done something similar with the carbon capture incentive program to help the industry. And the ability to stack these different incentives together with the carbon pricing really builds early incentive mechanisms to build out the industry. And that is so critical. And then, as you said, over time, then to basically develop that into more market-based structure will be critical. The other bit that I didn't mention, but which I think is really critical for this, is that industry and governments also develop transparent accounting mechanisms where CO2 molecules get effectively tracked and accounted for and verified across those value chains. Because I think only with those ecosystems, we are then able to ensure the environmental attribute or benefit of sequestering carbon is able to be attributed to whatever products ultimately are being sold into the market, and enable us to then create the benefits associated with decarbonizing our industry. So I think that whole ecosystem around tracking, verification, accounting of CO2 molecules and CO2 abatement is another key step that the industry needs to take in order really to scale.
I could not have said that better myself. I think really from my perspective, we as a society should be looking to pay for what we want, which in this case is, emissions abatement and avoiding the impacts of climate change. And that means, we got to set up the right policy incentives to incentivize those behaviors that we want, which ultimately is sequestration of emissions and hopefully avoidance of emissions as much as possible. So really, really well said. Maybe where I'd like to end is just on a positive or sort of a very future-looking note. And so I'll just put the question to you of, when you think about the next 10 years, so going out past 2030, past 2035, and even maybe the next 20 years or 30 years, and we're going to be coming up against the 2050 targets that you've alluded to, what really excites you the most about the future of CCS and Shell's activities in that area?
What excites me most, of course, in the short term, this year in particular, Chris, is the execution of Polaris and Atlas in Alberta, to see that project becoming a reality. The other thing that excites me is that we will receive the first customers in Northern Lights and see the first cryogenic value chain in the world taking shape. More fundamentally, I do believe that the industry is at an inflection point where we have seen about 50 million tons of injection capacity for a number of years now, but more and more you see now new investment decisions being taken in the CCS space. And I personally believe the more investment decisions that we'll see, the more infrastructure is built, the easier it will be to do follow-on projects, and we will see the industry scale significantly in the years to come. As we said earlier, the belief is that by the mid-2030s, we will have around a gigaton of installation, or the gigaton of injection capacity per year, up to 5 to 7 gigatons by 2050. And I think we are at the verge of seeing that industry scale. I personally believe that CCS is a key pillar in the energy transition. It's a key tool. It's a key tool next to a lot of other tools that we need to employ. But I believe that without CCS, we will really struggle to abate certain industries that are hard to electrify, or where we have significant requirements for direct heat, or have a lot of installed capital where it will take time to transition to a different energy system. And for all of these components, I'm a real optimist around the CCS industry in the near term.
Well, Bernhard, thank you so much for your time today. I think that's a really optimistic point to end things on. As I said, we are hoping that we're at that inflection point for the industry, and that we're at the beginning of a lot of really exciting developments in CCS. And as you said, there's going to be a number of checkpoints and milestones from here. Even this coming year, there's going to be some exciting developments out to 2030 and then beyond as we continue to chase those climate targets. So a really, really important area, and it's great to have folks like yourself that are devoting your efforts and time and energy to it. So thanks very much for your leadership in this area and for the great conversation today.
Yes, thanks, Chris, for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation on a topic that I think is absolutely critical in the energy transition. And as we discussed earlier, it will require all of us to collaborate and work together effectively to scale this industry. It is still a nascent business, and it requires conversations like this to create the public trust, to create the understanding of what it takes to build a successful CCS industry. So I really appreciate the time, really appreciate the questions, and thank you very much.